The latest event in the Magnus Carlsen chess tour has just begun. The Chessable Masters, some of the strongest players in the world playing online, including the world champion Magnus Carlsen himself. And they're playing preliminary group stages. And I thought the most intriguing battle yesterday was the game between Carlsen and Daniel Dubov. Dubov, of course, won the first event. We know how strong he is, what a creative player he is. And these two, Carlsen and Dubov, know each other extremely well, as Dubov, of course, was one of his helpers in the 2018 World Championship match. So here's their game. It was a very exciting affair. So it's a standard London system. Carlsen playing the bishop out to f4. And knight e4 from Dubov. So Carlsen decides to attack that with queen c2. Now, very interesting, e5. If the queen takes, then it'll be driven away, and then pawn takes bishop. Basically, black is doing fine there, having grabbed that dark square bishop. So the bishop dropped back to h2, all very normal. It looks a bit passive on h2. Actually, it has incredible latent pressure on this diagonal, and black has to be careful. Here, how many of us would just advance that f-pawn to cover the knight? But Dubov resists this temptation, and I think he's absolutely right, because, you know, so often that attack comes to nothing on the king side, and it just exposes the king on this diagonal. Knight g5, I think, is a much stronger move as played by Dubov. So some exchanges. I mean, these exchanges basically just relieve a little bit of congestion in black's position, but nothing very extraordinary so far. And here is an important moment. I think there is a temptation for black to play e4 and get one of these sort of standard King's Indian attack positions, but that would leave this bishop in an excellent position and gives white's counterattack on the queen side real power. So Dubov plays much better. Queen e7, just holding things for the moment. And the queen, of course, is on a useful square. Rook c1. Well, you could drop the bishop back here, but rook c1 is okay. Pawn takes pawn on d4, and here Carlsen thought for over a minute. Now, I don't know whether he overlooked what was coming next. If he wants a safe move, you can just recapture with the knight. And I mean, I would say white is just very slightly better there, with a little bit of potential to attack the pawn on d6, but fairly even. Instead, Carlsen went pawn takes pawn, which is sort of more ambitious because, well, white keeps a nice center. There's some pressure here from the bishop. Of course, if queen takes bishop, then you can just play rook e1, and that wins the rook on e8. But here's the trick. Dubov could just play knight f6 here, and I think white is slightly better. But instead, he went for it with bishop h6, attacking the rook. Now, if that rook ducks away, then you can take that bishop, because after rook e1, the queen is en prise. So basically, after bishop h6 attacking the rook, Carlsen has to give it up. Now, he reacted very quickly here and just played bishop d3. So I wonder whether he'd actually intended this sacrifice. It's hard to say. Anyway, bishop takes rook. He's given up rook for bishop, but he does have compensation. It's to do with that bishop lurking in the corner, slicing across the board, but soon perhaps to slice in this direction as well. So that's black's problem. He's given up his dark squared bishop. Interesting that, you know, Dubov didn't really hesitate for very long before grabbing that rook. But he's got to be careful now. So both sides playing ambitiously, and that bishop comes into play on these dark squares. Well, looking in both directions. Knight to f8, bishop g5, attacking the queen, which goes into the corner. Doesn't seem like a very beautiful square. And before the knight comes to e6, d5 from Carlsen, just preventing that and carving out some territory as well. C takes d5, c takes d5, and now the knight no longer has access to e6, so it just comes back again where it covers f6, but also it might be able to come into e5, possibly even c5. So now, how does Carlsen get in on those dart squares? Well, he played bishop b5, pinning here, and perhaps he just wants to eliminate that knight, which covers, for example, the f6 square. So if, let's say, a6, you can take and then play queen f4, and, well, we can see what's coming here. Bishop f6 and potentially queen takes d6 as well. So after bishop b5, Dubov just played queen g7, just to give that queen a little bit of breathing space. And here, if queen f4, then f6 will actually drive that bishop away and cover some dark squares. So bishop h6 from Carlsen, hitting the queen. Now here, if Carlsen wants, he can make a draw. He can play bishop g5. And I think Dubov can't really avoid this repetition. But Carlsen wanted more. He played a really ambitious move. Rook d4, looking to swing across here to hassle the queen. a6, putting the question to the bishop. Again, Carlsen could hit the queen and probably just go for a draw. But no, he wants more. Rook f4. Attacking the queen, queen back to e7. And if queen c3, well, threatens mate in 1, but then you've got f5, actually leaves the rook looking pretty silly. The queen covers g7. So after queen e7, bishop takes knight, bishop takes. So those dark squares are a little bit weaker now that that knight has been eliminated. Bishop g5 attacks the queen. Now if the queen comes down, then we've got queen c7, looking at these pieces. So Dubov counters with rook c8, and here is a crunch moment again in the game, where Carlsen could, if he wanted, go into an endgame. He could play queen takes rook, and that wins back an exchange. So bishop takes queen here, and this endgame, well, first of all let's prevent that bishop coming out. G4, king f8. It's about equal. I slightly prefer black because that pawn is on a light square and you never know, on a good day that bishop might be able to hit it. But it should be about even. That's the safe option. Does Carlsen go for the safe option? No. He wants to keep his chances of attacking on the dark squares alive. He played queen a1. Just to get his queen out of the way, avoid exchanges. I mean, this is extraordinary. It's incredibly risky. Did it pay off? Let's have a look. Queen e2. Dubov going on the counterattack. b3. Carlsen opens the diagonal. Rook c2. Looking dangerous, threatening queen takes pawn, and queen takes another pawn, checkmate. Carlsen's best option here is to play bishop h4, so he's pegged back. And now Dubov could play very ambitiously. He could take that pawn, but instead, very practical, he plays rook b2. I should say at this moment, both players were running pretty short of time. They start the games with 15 minutes. They get 10 seconds each time they make a move. But, I mean, from memory, Dubov was down to his last couple of minutes, maybe even less. So he played very practically. Rook b2 just shuts out the queen. King h2 from Carlsen, sort of avoiding checks on the back rank. And queen c2. This is really funny. Very practical way for Dubov to play. He checkmates Carlsen's queen. He's going to make absolutely sure that that queen is not going to deliver checkmate. Forces an exchange. Now, that has allowed Carlsen some activity with the rook. And Dubov's problems on the dark squares aren't quite over. That bishop controlling these squares, the rook, of course, at the moment that would be hazardous to advance up the board given the weakness of the back rank. But h6 solves the back rank problem. Dubov could have played bishop e4 there, but h6 is a safe move, a practical move, giving his king some room. He just wants to play king h7, g5, and put the king on g6, and then the king will be safe. Knight d2. Carlsen swings that knight round. Wasn't doing much on f3. Attacking the rook. Rook d1. Knight c4. Wants to get in on d6. Rook takes d5. Rook takes b7. So Dubov, a clear exchange up. But with this bishop on f6, he still has to be extremely careful. All Carlsen's pieces very active. Bishop e6. So what he's doing is targeting that knight on c4. Very practical move. Just eliminate dangerous pieces. Here, well, Carlsen could take that pawn, but after bishop takes knight, let's have a quick look at that. Here, that damages Carlsen's pawns on the queen side, and then king h7, and then you're going to play g5, king g6. That solves the problem of the king, and then it'll be time to target these pawns. Dubov definitely better. Carlsen would have no chance of winning that position, and in practical terms, very difficult to hold. So Carlsen thinks, right, I want to somehow keep the position complex, keep tactical possibilities alive. So he played knight b2. But this is risky in the extreme because now the rook hits the second rank. Looking at these points, king comes up to g3 to protect f2. g5, good move from Dubov, so his king just has some breathing room now. Rook takes pawn, so now it's all about the initiative. Now that the back rank problem has been solved, the rook goes onto the attack, and this is massive trouble for white. Carlsen tries to give his king some room, but it's now absolutely hopeless. The rook slams down. We've got double rooks on the 7th rank, attacking the pawn, attacking the knight, and here it has gone. Carlsen played the king here, and after rook takes bishop, he was a whole rook down and resigned the game. Fantastic struggle. Carlsen pushing so hard. That's what's so great about him. You know, he always gives his all. He could have had a draw. He could have played it safe, but he pushed. Dubov kept his head, played very practical chess, also very ambitiously. He didn't need to take that exchange right at the start, but defended against Carlsen's threats extremely well, and in the end was the deserved winner. So really intriguing. After that first day, Carlsen was on 2.5. The leader at the moment is Vladislav Artemyev, perhaps a new face for many of you, but an incredible talent, former European individual champion, another very strong Russian player. So anyway, early days. We've had just one day played, but looking really intriguing again.